You know, in most crossover scenarios with the My Hero Academia universe, characters usually get dropped straight into the franchise's main events. My Hero Academia establishes that every country has its own hero system, with its own top-ranked heroes. However, Kohei Horikoshi has largely kept the spotlight on Japan. Even with the limited information we have to keep the logic consistent, I made Nolan one of the top heroes representing the United States and had every major incident in the story begin in America.
The first sign was a dateline nobody wanted to read twice. Singapore, 3:47 in the morning, local time. The waterfront district near Marina Bay had been leveled in what early reports described as a structural collapse of extraordinary scale 12 city blocks, reduced to rubble in under 4 minutes, with no seismic activity recorded anywhere in the region. Emergency teams arriving at the scene found no survivors in the impact zone. They found no perpetrator, no evidence of organized attack, no trace consistent with any known quirk pattern or support gear methodology. What they found buried under 40 tons of displaced concrete was the body of a man who had until 72 hours prior been ranked the #1 hero in Southeast Asia. His name didn't matter to the news cycle for long. What mattered was the hole where Marina Bay used to be. The Hero Safety Commission in Tokyo received the report before dawn. A duty officer flagged it, passed it up the chain, and by 8 o'clock, a mid-level analyst had cross-referenced it with 2 other anomalous cases from the previous 3 weeks. She printed her summary, walked it to her supervisor's desk, and set it down without a word. Her supervisor read it standing up. He didn't sit down again for the rest of the morning. 2 weeks before Singapore, there had been Cairo. The Egyptian situation had been quieter, at least in terms of immediate media coverage. A desert site 40 kilometers south of the city, no civilian infrastructure involved, no photographs from bystanders. The official statement from the Egyptian Hero Bureau described it as a training accident involving experimental support technology. The statement was retracted 11 hours later and replaced with a 1-paragraph notice citing an ongoing investigation. The top-ranked hero of North Africa had not been seen since. His support team, who had accompanied him to the site, were all confirmed dead. The terrain at the location had been compressed, not blasted, not burned, but compressed downward, as if something of extraordinary mass had driven through it at velocity and kept going. The analyst's summary contained one sentence that her supervisor underlined 3 times. Both sites display terminal force consistent with close-range blunt trauma applied at speeds exceeding reliable measurement. By 9 in the morning, the Commission's emergency channel had 2 more entries. A hero in Brazil ranked 7th in South America had missed her scheduled patrol check-in. Her last known location was a mountain ridge in Minas Gerais. A rescue team dispatched to the coordinates found no body and no wreckage. Only a trench gouged through 300 meters of rock, clean-edged as a surgical cut running due north before vanishing at the cliff face. The second entry was from Norway, ranked 4th in Europe. Last seen on coastal patrol near Bergen, his communicator had transmitted one partial signal before going offline. Not a distress call, not a status update, just a burst of static that the signals team would spend the next 6 days analyzing. Before concluding it was the sound of something moving faster than the recording equipment could track. In the Commission's Tokyo headquarters, a senior officer named Nakamura spread the 5 reports across his conference table and stood back to look at them, the way a man looks at a crack in a load-bearing wall. He was 53 years old. He had worked in Hero Safety Administration for 26 years. In that time, he had seen organized villain networks, quirk-driven territorial violence, political interference in hero licensing. He had learned to recognize the shape of those threats. What he was looking at now had no shape he recognized. The Commission was built to handle villain crime, domestic quirk-based, bounded by the logic of ambition and territory. This was something else entirely. It moved through the world's highest-ranked heroes without hesitation, without deviation, without any particular interest in being noticed. Nothing in their procedures covered it. Nothing in their institutional history suggested it was possible. He picked up his phone and made 3 calls. The first was to his counterpart at the American Hero Safety Authority. The second was to an international coordination contact. The Commission had never previously activated a line reserved according to its own documentation for situations that fall outside domestic response capacity. The third call was shorter than the other 2. When it ended, he set the phone down and did not pick it up again for 40 minutes. All 3 calls ended the same way: a brief exchange of information, a long silence, then the specific sound of someone choosing their next words very carefully. On the other side of the Pacific, the morning light hit New York at a different angle. A press briefing was already underway in a glass-fronted room on the 42nd floor of a building that didn't appear on most public maps. The officials present had the particular posture of people who had been awake since the previous night and had no intention of admitting it. 3 screens behind the briefing podium displayed satellite imagery, site coordinates, and a timeline that one attendee later described in a private message to a colleague as looking like someone's grocery list, if the grocery list was the apocalypse. The spokesperson for the American Hero Safety Authority was a woman named Patricia Wen, and she had spent 30 years in crisis communications, learning how to say almost nothing in a way that sounded like almost everything. She was good at her job. What she was not good at, what nobody in the room was good at, was explaining to a live feed of international observers that 5 of the world's most formidable heroes had been neutralized over 6 weeks, leaving behind no perpetrator, no motive that fit any existing model, and no method of attack that threat assessment had ever cataloged. She said, "Structural failure, ongoing investigation. Coordinated assessment, international cooperation, no credible domestic threat at this time." She said it smoothly. She said it twice. Then she paused to take a sip of water, and in that pause, a reporter in the 3rd row asked the question that everyone in the room had been holding since they walked in. "Is there a single actor responsible for all 5 of these?" Patricia Wen set her water glass down. "We are not in a position to confirm that characterization. That's not a denial. That's the position of this authority at this time." The reporter held her gaze for 3 seconds and then wrote something in her notebook. Whatever she wrote, it ran as the headline within 40 minutes. Retell. The briefing was still live on 3 networks when Nolan Grayson arrived at the building. He came through the main entrance the way he always did, unhurried nodding to the security desk, by name his civilian clothes unremarkable, in the way that very expensive simplicity always is. A gray shirt, dark trousers, shoes that made no sound on the lobby tile. He was, by any visible measure, a man in his mid-40s, with the build of someone who had spent a serious portion of his life doing physical work. The mustache was the only thing that ever made anyone look twice, and even then, the second look never produced anything useful. He took the elevator to the secure floor, presented his credentials without being asked, and entered the crisis room, where the authority's senior staff had convened. The room smelled of cold coffee and acute anxiety. He listened to the briefing summary for 11 minutes. He asked 3 questions, 2 about chronology, 1 about the compressed terrain in the Cairo report, and the questions were so precise, delivered in such an even tone, that 2 people in the room independently made notes to mention his composure later as an example of steadiness under pressure. When the summary concluded, Nolan looked at the map on the central screen. Singapore, Cairo, Brazil, Norway. The 5th marker, the one without a confirmed location, was placed somewhere over the North Atlantic. "I can run a regional sweep," he said. "Give me 48 hours." The authorities director nodded. "We'd appreciate that." He glanced briefly at the room, then back. "We can't put a team in the air for this, not after Brazil. Whatever is out there, we're not sending more people toward it blind. You're the only one who can cover that distance without support." Understood. Nolan held the director's gaze for exactly as long as appropriate and then turned toward the door. Kathleen's been briefed. She's handling the domestic assessment. Good. She'll know what to look for. Nobody in the room thought to question that. Nobody had any reason to. He was Omni-Man. He had saved this country 11 times in a calendar year. He had pulled a collapsing highway overpass apart with his bare hands, while cameras rolled and 40 million people watched. His picture was on a postage stamp. The elevator took him back to the lobby. The lobby doors opened onto the street. The city moved around him at its ordinary pace, taps construction noise, someone selling coffee from a cart on the corner, and Nolan Grayson walked into it with his hands in his pockets and his face completely neutral. And nobody who saw him that morning would have been able to say later that anything about him seemed wrong. Kathleen Bate read the same 5 reports in a different room, in a different building, at a different hour. She read them the way she read everything once through, quickly, then back from the end. It was a habit from her military years, the idea being that if you absorb a document's conclusion first, you could spend the second pass watching how the argument built towards something it had already decided. A useful method for intelligence briefings. A useful method for most things. She set the reports down. She pulled up the timeline on her tablet and laid it flat on the table. 6 weeks, 5 heroes, no trace evidence, no witness accounts of quirk activation at any of the sites. No organization claiming credit. No ransom demand, no manifesto, no escalation logic that matched any recorded model of villain ambition or territorial aggression. She sat with that for a while. Then she opened a separate file, one she had started herself, not part of the official dossier, and added a column she had been constructing quietly for the past 10 days. Timestamps, patrol logs, flight manifests, public appearance records, scheduled communicator maintenance windows. She cross-referenced them against the 5 dates. She stared at the result for a long time, long enough that her coffee went from hot to lukewarm to cold. Then she closed the file, saved it to her personal secured drive under a clearance tier that required her biometric confirmation to open, and sat very still while the city outside her window carried on in complete ignorance of what she had just found. She did not call the authority. She did not call the director. She did not forward anything to the International Coordination Channel. She picked up a pen and wrote 4 words on the inside cover of her personal notebook in handwriting, small enough that no one across a table could read it. Verify before you move. Outside, a news ticker scrolled across the screen of a television mounted in the hallway. Another senior hero, this one based out of Seoul, had failed to check in for a scheduled debrief. Preliminary reports placed his last known position at a collapsed tunnel system in the Taebaek Mountains. The ticker moved on. Kathleen did not look up. She was already counting. The location she chose was a decommissioned naval air station on the Georgia coast, 43 kilometers from the nearest populated area. Flat open, surrounded on 3 sides by marsh. She had requisitioned access through her standard operational clearance and filed a solo training notation, the sort of paperwork that generated no flags because she filed it constantly. She had also 2 days prior let slip to the authorities' scheduling office that she would be conducting an aerial patrol sweep along the Atlantic seaboard on Thursday morning. A specific corridor, a specific window. Logged formally. Completely fictitious. If someone were cross-referencing her movements against an opportunity Thursday morning over the Atlantic, would look exactly right. She arrived at the air station on Wednesday night. The perimeter was dark by the time she landed. She moved through the old hangars without lights, using the layout she had memorized from the facility blueprints, and set up what she needed in the main runway. Clearing open sky above, nothing within blast radius worth preserving. and a secured telemetry relay routed through a military satellite link that no hostile party could locate or cut. It would not capture everything. The relay was built for long-range targeting, not documentation, but it would capture enough. Under emergency protocol, her clearance covered the whole arrangement. She pulled her cape around her shoulders against the salt wind and waited. He came in the early hours of the morning. No warning. No approach sound she could register until the last fraction of a second. Just a compression of air that her body understood before her mind did. And she moved left hard, and the strike that should have caught the back of her skull passed close enough that she felt the displaced atmosphere rake across her ear. She came out of the roll already standing new. New order, already running the first law, already set. My body's strength won't be capped by its usual limits in this fight. It locked into place, like a second skeleton, bracing around the first. Nolan landed 20 meters away. He straightened without hurry, the white and red of his suit catching what little moonlight reached the runway. The mustache, the broad shoulders, the bearing of a man who had never in his life needed to be careful. He regarded her the way you regard a door you expected to open without resistance. "You weren't on the Atlantic corridor," he said. "No." A beat. He tilted his head slightly, recalibrating. "How long?" "Long enough." She kept her weight centered, tracking his hands. "I filed a report with the authorities' internal review board 9 days ago. Flagged the timeline correlations. They told me the data was circumstantial and asked me to hold pending further analysis." She paused. "I held for 9 days. And now you just tried to kill me from behind on a federal installation, so I think we're past the circumstantial threshold." He said nothing. Whatever internal calculation he had been running produced its answer, and she watched his posture shift by approximately 2 degrees. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would read as a tell to anyone who hadn't spent years studying how bodies change when they stop performing. "Tell me who you told," he said. "You want to know what I actually have? I want to know if anyone else has it." She let that land without reacting. "Singapore, the window between your last confirmed comm contact and your reappearance at a closed federal summit in Denver, was 11 hours and 40 minutes. The distance works commercially if you have 16 hours. You had 11. She watched his face. "At the pace you've shown in public that math doesn't close. Which means what you show the public isn't your real ceiling." She continued before he could respond. "Cairo was tighter. You attended a debrief at Fort Meade on time. The Egyptian site doesn't work at any publicly documented speed, not even close. Brazil almost broke the window entirely, but your communicator went to scheduled maintenance for 4 hours that afternoon. Documented. Routine." She tilted her head. "Funny how the maintenance always lands right." The quiet that followed was the kind that arrives when someone stops performing innocence. "You didn't tell anyone," he said. "If I was wrong, I destroy the authorities' relationship with the most capable hero on the roster over a timestamp correlation. If I was right," she let the rest of that sentence go unfinished. He could complete it. "I flagged it internally. That was the system doing its job. The system said, wait. So I built a different kind of trap and came here instead." Nolan's gaze moved to the runway, then to the dark perimeter, then back. Something crossed his expression, not guilt, nothing approaching it. More like the acknowledgement of a well-positioned obstacle. A chess player noting the board had gotten interesting. "You're right," he said. "It was me." No elaboration. No justification volunteered. Just the flat declaration of someone who had operated long enough that the truth cost him nothing. "All of them?" she asked. "All of them." "Why?" "Because your world needs to be ready for what's coming. It isn't." He said it with the patience of someone stating a fact that has long since ceased to be debatable. The people at the top of your rankings are the ones who might make real resistance possible, which means they need to be gone before the arrival window closes. She held his gaze. Arrival window. Something larger than me is coming. No emphasis, no theater. The tone of someone reporting weather. I'm not doing this for myself. I'm clearing the field. Your symbols, your pillars, the people your society believes can handle the unsolvable, they need to be removed before the people I work for arrive. Because if they're still standing, this takes longer and costs more than it has to. Who are you working for? You wouldn't have a useful frame of reference. He let that sit. And it doesn't change what happens next. Try me. No. Final, delivered without heat. You're asking for details because you think details change outcomes. They don't. She had anticipated something like this, prepared for it in the 9 days she waited. Still hearing it confirmed and then immediately dismissed, hearing him treat the dead as a necessary column in a ledger, produced a hard clarity that settled below her ribs. Not anger exactly, not fear exactly. The particular sensation of understanding precisely how large a problem is at the moment. You can no longer pass it to anyone else. I'm calling a restricted airspace order over this installation, she said. 20-kilometer radius. Military enforcement under DoD Joint Protocol. Nobody in, nobody out. She held his gaze. Not for my protection. Because if this goes wrong, I don't want rescue teams flying into the edge of it. Considerate. Practical. She reached for the comm line on her gauntlet and keyed the code she had pre-staged 12 hours earlier. Somewhere above them, a routing order moved through 3 separate air traffic channels at once. 6 minutes to full propagation. She had accounted for that. This stays between us. You think you can finish this? I think one of us will. Something in his face went very still. Then not a shift in expression so much as the removal of the last layer of the performance dissolving. He studied her for a moment with the cool attention of someone assessing a variable they hadn't fully weighted. You should have died over the Atlantic, he said, not a threat. An observation the way a navigator notes a course error without emotion. Probably, Kathleen said. The wind crossed the runway. Out in the marsh, something called once and went silent. Then he moved. He crossed 20 meters in the time it takes to blink. She was moving before she saw him move. She had decided before this began that waiting to register his approach would mean she was dead before the thought completed. She dropped left and angled hard in the air where her head had been collapsed inward, with a crack that split the tarmac beneath the pressure wave. Concrete chunked upward. The nearest hangar wall buckled. She set the second rule while still mid-pivot. The air above this field will resist his movement. The snap of it going into effect was immediate. The atmosphere around Nolan thickened, pushed back against anything moving through it at the velocity he had been using. A drag, not a wall. Enough to cost him a fraction of a second on the next approach. She used that fraction. Her hands came together and she drove them downward, and the air giant answered. It rose out of the cracked tarmac like something pulled from the ground. Rather than summoned from above, a construct of pressurized atmosphere shaped roughly in her image. But 4 stories of it, fists the size of cargo containers. The surface split in a starburst where it formed. The marsh on the eastern edge detonated outward in a wave of black water and disturbed earth. The old hangars simply stopped existing in any useful structural sense. Nolan didn't try to match it. He went under it, not around, not through under, dropping below the giant's reach and cutting along the ground at an angle she hadn't covered. And when he came up, he was past the construct and closing on her actual body. with the economical precision of someone who had fought large things for a very long time and understood that large things have operators. She redirected the giant's left arm across his path. He hit the compressed air limit full speed, and even at full speed, it stopped him for 1 full second it held. And she heard something in that collision that sounded geological. Felt the ground shudder through her boots. Then his hand went through it. He found the structural gap, the seam between the rule's effective zone and the ambient air, and his fist came through the edge of the construct like a blade through a fold-in fabric, and the impact on her shoulder spun her sideways and took 30 meters of cracked surface with it. She landed mid-calculation. The giant was dissolving. Maintaining it was costing half her concentration, and half her concentration was not enough at this range. She let it go. The pressurized air came apart in a shockwave that knocked water off the marsh surface in every direction simultaneously, and then there was just open ground between them, and Nolan was in motion again. She released the atmospheric rule and poured everything into the strength buff. He hit her 3 times in just over a second. The first drove her back 20 meters. The second was meant for her jaw, and she got her forearm up in time, and the deflected force took out the concrete embankment behind her in a horizontal line. The third she ate fully center mass, and the noise it made when it connected was not something the human throat produces. It was the sound of 2 incompatible scales of force meeting in the same body. She was still standing. That registered with him. He pulled back fractionally, recalibrating, not retreating, and she used the half second to close the gap herself, driving forward with everything the buff was giving her. And for approximately 4 seconds they exchanged at the same rate, and the tarmac between them ceased to exist as a physical surface. She needed to touch him. 1 clean contact, hand to skin, or suit his name in her throat at the moment it landed. Omni Man. He read it. She hadn't spoken yet. The syllable was still forming, but he read the intent in how her hand angled, and instead of pulling back, he pressed forward inside the reach of her arm, and his elbow caught her chin and shut the word off before it left her mouth. The ground arrived with significant force. She was back up in under 2 seconds. The buff was holding. Her jaw was not broken. Those were the 2 facts that mattered. He stood 10 meters away watching her with the patient attention of someone who has identified how a mechanism works and is deciding where to dismantle it. "You're trying to say my name," he said. She didn't answer. Confirming anything narrowed her options. Contact. That's the hinge. He tilted his head in that same recalibrating angle from an hour ago when he had still been performing. Complicated system. He came in again, and this time he was preventing her hands from reaching him, rather than landing clean strikes. The approach stayed tight inside her guard before she had fully set, and she took 2 more hits she could absorb and tried twice to get a hand on his collar. And he was simply not there both times. Not faster than her hands, just angled away from them, 2 degrees off alignment each time, with the infuriating precision of someone who had fought for centuries and understood exactly how desperate grabs telegraph themselves. She bought separation with a body-level shove that excavated the earth beneath him and sent him back 40 meters into the tree line at the field's northern edge. The trees did not survive. North was the only cover he'd used. She set a new rule while he was still registering the tree line. No object larger than a closed fist will approach me from the north at speed. Limited. Directional. She had 3 seconds before he mapped around it. She used them to close the gap herself. She was a step away, close enough to reach close enough that his name was forming, and his hand closed around her wrist. Not to block, to control. He pivoted, used her momentum against its own direction, and drove her into the earth at an angle that took both of them deep into the surface. The impact threw a disk of shattered asphalt 50 meters in every direction. They came up from the crater at the same moment, and he had her left arm in a lock that cost her the reach she needed. She broke the lock the way you break something that needs breaking. He barely reacted to the pain of it, noted it, adjusted his grip, kept her from closing. "Skin contact," he said almost to himself. Or the name, one or the other. She drove her free elbow into his ribs. At full buff, the impact moved him backward, his grip on her arm loosened by a degree that was just enough. She got her hand to the side of his face. "Omni." His head turned, just slightly, just enough that her palm hit the suit at the wrong angle. Not the contact she intended, not the surface the rule needed to anchor to, and the name dissolved before it reached the air. He stepped back, gave her 2 full meters, which under any other circumstances would have read as generosity. It was space to observe. She understood what he was doing. He had stopped trying to end this quickly. He was studying new order the way a surgeon studies anatomy, not to appreciate it to find where to cut. She had maybe 30 seconds before he found something she couldn't recover from. She released both active rules. The relief was physical, like dropping a weight she hadn't fully registered carrying. Both slots opened. She used one immediately to rebuild the strength buff at maximum. The second she held. He came in the moment the atmospheric rule dropped. And she took the hit and used the pain to focus and drove her fist into the earth between them. The relay indicator on her gauntlet was still lit. It was catching fragments. Whatever it was catching was transmitting. She had one move left that carried real scale. She called the Tiamat protocol. The response came in 11 seconds. She felt the low-frequency vibration in her boots before she heard anything, the sound of scramjet propulsion crossing into her airspace from 2 offshore staging points converging on her coordinates. She had filed the activation pathway into the military routing system 6 days ago, buried in a logistics amendment that nobody would have read carefully enough to flag. She set the second rule. These munitions will carry my force. The sky split. 7 missiles came in on converging vectors, and she met them not as impact, but as extension. Her body's intention transmitted through the rule into their warheads. And she brought them together over his position in a single compressing detonation that she felt through every bone she owned. Not nuclear. More focused than nuclear, all of that energy delivered to one point, shaped by her intention with the concentrated quality of a directed instrument, rather than a spreading bloom. The tarmac evaporated for 200 meters. When the pressure wave cleared 3 seconds that felt geological, Nolan was still standing in the center of what had been ground level and was now a depression 12 meters deep. His suit was scorched at the edges. His posture had not changed. He looked up at her through the settling debris. The buff was gone. She had released it to power the second rule, and without it she was fast and strong in the way that top heroes are fast and strong. Which was a different category from what she had been 30 seconds ago. And a different category again from what he was. She knew this. She had known this before the fight began. She started to reset the buff rule. He was in motion before she finished the thought. He covered the 12 meters of vertical and the open ground between them in a time she could not consciously process, and the strike that followed was not the calibrated tactical pressure of the previous 2 minutes. It was a Viltrumite killing line. Full commitment. Nothing held back. She got one arm up. It didn't matter. The force went through the arm and through what was behind the arm and drove her into the earth at the far end of the field, and the earth accepted her with a particular finality of something that had been waiting for the conversation to end. She did not get back up. The relay indicator on her gauntlet blinked twice. Then it held steady. Somewhere above a military satellite array, a compressed data packet was queuing for transmission. It contained 47 seconds of fragmentary telemetry, most of it motion blur and impact signatures too fast for the relay's targeting optics to resolve. The last 12 seconds were clear. Clear enough? Nolan stood at the edge of the crater she had made with the Tiamat strike and did not look at what was behind him. He looked at the sky. The salt marsh had been pushed back to the tree line on all sides. The hangars were geometry now, flat shapes pressed into the earth. What remained of the field was a record of the fight, a sequence of craters and compression scars that a forensic team would spend weeks interpreting. He checked the time. Then he rose straight up, no arc, no transition, and within 4 seconds he had passed the cloud layer, and within 30, he was at an altitude where no tracking array in service would locate him against the background noise of the upper atmosphere. He turned east. Below him, the relay finished its transmission. The data packet reached its destination simultaneously in 3 government facilities and 1 private channel Kathleen Bate had pre-authorized before she drove to Georgia. In a situation room in Washington, a duty officer opened the file. She watched 12 seconds of footage. Then she watched it again. Then she picked up the priority line and said nothing for a long moment. Because there was no established language for what the footage showed, and every adjacent term in the existing vocabulary was completely inadequate. The ticker on the wall screen already carried the first line, Incident, Georgia Coast Details, Unconfirmed. By morning, it would have a name. By afternoon, it would have a face. By the following day, the face would be on every screen in the country. And the country would be trying to understand how the person it had trusted most had been the architecture of its greatest threat. And the trying would not produce an answer because there was no answer available at the scale people were accustomed to working in. Nolan Grayson had been their postage stamp. Now he was somewhere above the Atlantic, moving east at a velocity the instruments couldn't hold, and America's #1 hero was in the ground in Georgia. And the world that had existed the previous morning was not the world that existed now. The ticker scrolled. The situation room went very quiet. The silence lasted exactly as long as it took someone to realize they needed to start making calls. The footage ran on a 6-second loop in the situation room for 11 minutes before anyone spoke, not because they needed to watch it again. Because watching it again was easier than being the first person to say what it meant. The recording was fragmentary for the first 35 seconds, motion blur impact signatures, a heat plume that bloomed and collapsed faster than the relay's optics could track. Then the image stabilized. 12 seconds of clarity, a figure in white and red, standing at the center of a crater that had not existed 20 minutes earlier. A figure in a star and stripe cape at the far edge of the frame, not moving. And then the white and red figure rose straight up, no arc, and in 4 seconds, the sky where he had been was empty. The deputy director of the American Hero Safety Authority set her coffee down very carefully, the way people set things down when they are afraid their hands might not be steady. "Pull every domestic asset," she said. "I want orbital surveillance tasking in the next 10 minutes. I want every allied agency on the same channel." She paused. "And I want someone to tell me where he is right now." The answer came back in 40 seconds. He wasn't anywhere the instruments could confirm. The upper atmosphere returned noise. The satellite array had nothing. Air traffic control across the eastern seaboard had logged a single anomaly. An unregistered contact climbing through 40,000 feet at a rate that no known aircraft classification matched, and then nothing. He had left the part of the sky that radar owns. The deputy director looked at the empty tracking display for a long beat. "Global alert, Chesa Mals," she said. "Full designation. Omni-Man is classified as an active threat to international security, effective immediately." She picked up her coffee again. "Get me the commission in Tokyo." The alert reached 37 countries in under an hour. It moved faster than the footage, which was still being verified and contextualized and argued over in secure channels before anyone authorized its broader release. But the alert itself, the designation, the name, the classification, needed no footage to be believed. The preceding 6 weeks had already done that work. The dots connected themselves the moment someone drew the line between them. By noon, the face that had been on a postage stamp was on a threat assessment dossier. By mid-afternoon, it was on screens in government buildings on 4 continents. By evening, it had reached the public through the kind of leak that happens when classified information is too large to stay contained, not through any single source, but through 100 simultaneous pieces, each one small enough to be denied and collectively impossible to suppress. The reaction was not panic. It was something quieter and more durable than panic. It was the sensation spreading city by city and hour by hour of a floor that had seemed solid, proving on inspection to have always been suspended over open air. Hero agencies worldwide reported a surge in emergency line volume. People were not calling to report crimes. They were calling to ask if they were safe. The distinction mattered. Crime reporting calls meant people still believed the system could respond. Safety calls meant something had shifted in how people understood what the system was for. In Tokyo, the Hero Public Safety Commission convened an emergency session in the middle of the night. A senior commission officer who had not slept stood at the head of the table and said what everyone in the room was already thinking, that they needed to assess whether Japan's current threat posture was adequate for an entity that had just neutralized the top-ranked hero in the Western world in under 5 minutes from first contact to telemetry loss. The room was quiet for a beat after he said it. Then someone asked what they were supposed to do with that assessment, and nobody had a good answer, and the meeting continued without. All Might received the briefing through official channels before dawn. A commission liaison brought it to him in person, a printed summary, because the liaison had been told not to use digital transmission for anything related to this, not yet. He read it standing. He did not change expression in any way the liaison could identify. "The footage," he said. "Is it confirmed? Forensic analysis is ongoing. The telemetry data is confirmed." He handed the summary back. Kathleen Bate was the top-ranked hero in the United States. "Yes." "And the entity responsible?" "Omni Man." "Yes." He was quiet for a beat. The liaison, who had spent 15 years working adjacent to people with enormous power and had learned to read the distinct quality of their silences, recognized that this one was not grief and not fear. It was the stillness of someone who has just been told that the category of problem they have been preparing for their entire career is not the category of problem that is actually arriving. "Whatever this is," All Might said, "it didn't come from here." "No. That matters." He turned toward the window. Outside, the city was dark, operating in full ignorance of what had been transmitted across the Pacific 3 hours ago. "Keep this contained as long as you can. When it breaks, and it will break, people will need to see that someone is still standing." The liaison left. All Might remained at the window. He did not reach for the phone. He did not call the agency. He stood and looked at the city and knew in the deep quiet of the hour before sunrise, when everything else had gone still, that the next time he walked out that door, as the symbol of peace, the symbol would be carrying a different weight than it had the day before. He was prepared for that. He had always been prepared for that. What he was less certain about was whether the weight had a ceiling. Nolan crossed the Pacific in the dark. At the altitude he was holding, the curvature of the planet was visible not dramatically, not the way it looks in photographs, but as a persistent sense that the horizon was slightly wrong, slightly curved away from where geometry said it should be. The air at this height was thin enough to be irrelevant. He breathed anyway, more habit than need. Viltrumite physiology accommodated discomfort, The way water accommodates a stone dropped into it briefly, and then not at all. He had no interest in the drama of what had just happened. That was one of the things that distinguished a soldier from a spectacle. Spectacles needed audiences. Soldiers needed results. Two pillars remained, one in the open, one in shadow. Both would have to come down in the same operation. Because separated, they were dangerous, and together, paradoxically, they would be dangerous in ways that partially canceled each other out. The timing had to be exact. Below him, the lights of the Pacific coastline appeared and disappeared between cloud cover. He adjusted his heading by 3 degrees. Japan was minutes away at this pace, close enough that he would arrive before dawn, before the news cycle had fully processed what had happened in Georgia, before the commission had finished its emergency session, before the hero agencies had translated their alarm into anything resembling a coordinated response. Before, in other words, anyone had time to build a defense around what they were afraid of losing. He did not think about Kathleen Bate. She had been a soldier doing her job, and she had done it better than almost anyone he had encountered on this planet. That was a fact he held with something adjacent to respect, the detached acknowledgement that a well-made instrument had performed as designed before it broke. The lights of the Japanese coastline resolved out of the dark below. He did not descend. He held altitude circled once at a distance no ground array would resolve, as anything identifiable and assessed. The city below was calm. That would change. But for now it was calm, and its calmness was a resource he intended to use. 300 kilometers away, in a location that had no official address and no registered occupants, a message moved. It traveled through channels that did not use the same infrastructure as ordinary communication. Not the internet, not mobile networks, not anything the authorities monitored in the conventional sense. It moved through the architecture that exists in every society. Beneath the visible one, the network of obligations and fear and shared interest that connects people who have collectively decided that the rules do not apply to them. The message was short. It did not name its sender. It said only, "The fence is down. Move when ready." In 17 locations across Greater Japan, people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of signal began quietly and without any visible urgency to move. The hero agency's emergency lines were still processing the surge from the international alert. The commission was still in session. The defense posture of the entire system was pointed at this instant at the sky, at the threat that had come from outside, from beyond the established categories of danger. Nobody was looking at what was already inside. The news broke in the early morning Tokyo time, and it broke the way large things break. Not with a single crack, but with a series of smaller ones, each one widening the next. By 7, the footage had cleared government verification and was moving through broadcast channels. By 7:30, every major network in Japan was running the same 12 seconds on loop, and the commentary filling the space around those 12 seconds was the sound of people trained to explain things, encountering something that did not fit any explanatory structure they had been given. The Hero Public Safety Commission's Public Affairs Office released a statement at 8. It was 4 sentences long. It said that the incident was confirmed, that the international community was coordinating a response, that the public should maintain normal routines, and that response teams across Japan were operating at full capacity. The phones started ringing before the statement finished publishing. Not crime reports, not emergencies. People calling to ask whether normal routines were actually normal, whether full capacity meant what it usually meant, whether there was something the statement was choosing not to say. The lines stayed busy through the morning and into the afternoon, and the bureaus fielding the calls did so with the professional steadiness of institutions that understood their primary function had shifted, at least for now, from response to reassurance. It was a function they had not been designed to perform indefinitely. The underworld moves differently than governments do. It doesn't hold emergency sessions or issue statements. It reads conditions, adjusts positions, and acts when the margin looks favorable. What the previous 24 hours had communicated to every organized criminal network in Greater Japan was simple and required no interpretation. The enforcement system was pointing all of its attention at the sky, which meant the ground was less watched than it had been yesterday. By afternoon, 3 separate organized operations had advanced their timelines. None of them were impulsive. All of them had been waiting for precisely this kind of atmospheric shift, an opening when the response infrastructure was overextended, overwatched, and psychologically off balance. The operations targeted infrastructure rather than people, a logistics hub in Kanagawa, a financial relay point in Osaka, a communications node that 3 different bureaus used for encrypted coordination in central Tokyo. The 3 were the strikes. The rest of the 17 mobilizations were positioning probes decoys. The last named target was not chosen randomly. Response units noticed the pattern mid-afternoon. It took another 40 minutes to confirm that the 3 operations were linked. Same methods, same timing, precision, same approach to avoiding detection. The kind of coordination that did not happen without a central intelligence directing it. A senior analyst at the commission filed an internal note shortly after. She wrote 2 sentences, then deleted them, then rewrote them more carefully. This is not opportunism. This is a prepared operation that has been waiting for the right conditions. Someone decided these conditions are right. She flagged the note for immediate review. It reached the commission director's desk within the hour. By then, the communications node in central Tokyo had gone offline. All Might had been in the building since 5 in the morning. Not because anyone had called him in, because he had read the commission statement at 8, read the public response by 9, and by 10 had identified the structural problem. Not the news itself, but what the news was doing to the load-bearing assumption that underpinned the entire hero system. That there was always someone capable of handling whatever the worst case turned out to be. He delayed making himself visible because visibility before he understood the situation would waste the weight that visibility carried. He waited. When the report on the coordinated operations came through in the late afternoon, he read it standing the way he always read things that required a decision. He made the decision in under a minute. "The communications node," he said to the commission liaison in the room. "That's the one they want us to look at. It's been flagged, not as the primary target, as the address." He set the report down. "Someone wants us to come to that location. They've made it too clean not to be intentional." He reached for his jacket. "Pull back the response teams from Kanagawa and Osaka. Get civilians out of a 2-block radius around the node. Don't announce why. If you're right about who's there, then the evacuation is necessary," he said. "And if I'm wrong, it's a precaution. Either way, do it." He did not wait for confirmation. He was out the door before the liaison finished reaching for the comm. The block around the communications node had the quality of a held breath. 3 units were in the area, 2 on perimeter, 1 on approach, and all of them were operating on the instruction that this was a standard infrastructure recovery. Most of them believed it. The ones who didn't were the ones who had been in the field long enough to recognize the difference between a scene that is dangerous and a scene that has been arranged to look dangerous in a particular direction. All Might arrived from the west, which was not the approach any logical assessment of the situation would have suggested. He had accounted for that. The building was 7 stories glass and steel, the kind of architecture that exists in every urban center and conveys nothing about itself. The ground floor windows had been darkened from the inside. The main entrance was open. He went in through the 4th floor. The interior was empty in the way that rooms are empty when they have recently been occupied and vacated with care. Every surface was clean. Nothing had been left by accident. He heard the voice from the floor above. I wondered which entrance you'd choose. Conversational, unhurried. The voice of a man who had been waiting without impatience the way predators wait when they are certain the prey will arrive. All Might moved to the stairwell and looked up. All for One stood on the 6th floor landing, dressed in a dark suit over a white collar. The life support apparatus around his throat catching the ambient light through the windows behind him. His ruined face conveyed nothing legible. His bearing conveyed everything a man who had chosen this location, this hour, this configuration, and was entirely satisfied with his choices. You're not here for the node, All Might said. The node served its purpose. All for One tilted his head slightly, as did the operations in Kanagawa and Osaka. They put your units squarely where I needed them. A brief pause. And they put you here. Then say what you came to say. I came to demonstrate something. His voice was patient, the patience of someone with a very long view of time. The world spent 6 weeks watching its symbols disappear one by one. Now it watches its greatest symbol's counterpart, me, walk openly into the vacuum that leaves behind. He spread his hand slightly, a gesture of mild presentation. The question your system cannot currently answer is which of us is the larger problem. That uncertainty is itself the point. All Might descended 2 steps. You think this is an opportunity? I know it is. No heat, flat precision. Your response infrastructure is overextended. Your public is frightened. Your international partners are managing their own crises. And the entity that killed Kathleen Bate is somewhere above this city right now. Which means your attention is divided before I've done anything. He paused. I have done something, of course. But we'll get to that. All Might crossed to the 6th floor in an instant. The air cannon came before he landed, a compressed burst that would have taken a less experienced fighter through the wall behind them, and All Might deflected it with a Texas smash that sent the force back into the stairwell and brought 2 floors of ceiling infrastructure down in a cascade of concrete and steel framing. All for One was gone from the landing. Airwar walk, the precise kind that involves no wasted motion, had repositioned him to the building's exterior in the interval between deflection and follow-through. He stood on the facade, one hand braced against the glass, and looked down at All Might through the shattered window. Not yet, he said. There's one more piece that needs to be in position. He tilted his head toward the sky, a gesture so brief it might have been involuntary. You felt it too, I think, when you came in. All Might had felt it. He had not named it. Something in the pressure of the air above the building. Something in the quality of the silence that had settled over this block. And not the adjacent ones, the kind of stillness that arrives not when nothing is present, but when something very large is holding very still. All for One stepped back from the facade and dropped unhurried to the street. The warping effect took him moments later. And then he was gone, and the block was quiet again, and the units on the perimeter were converging on the building. All Might stood at the broken window and looked at the sky. It was empty. It had been empty all day. He did not believe it was empty. At an altitude where the city lights below formed a continuous grid and individual streets were indistinguishable from each other, Nolan watched the warping effect dissipate at street level and noted that All for One had exited the engagement, calculated. He had come to show himself, not to finish anything. Both of them had surfaced now. The symbol of peace and the architect of organized evil, forced into the same location by a chain of events that Nolan had not engineered but had read correctly. They would not remain in separate corners of the city much longer. The pressure he had applied globally and what All for One had just done locally had begun the process of compression. He adjusted his position by half a degree. One would hide if the other fell first. That was the constraint the timing had to solve. They needed to be in the same place, committed before either of them had room to recalculate. The commission would spend the next several hours trying to understand what had happened in that central Tokyo building. All Might would spend those hours doing what All Might did, staying visible, staying between the public and the threat. Staying visible would cost him. That was fine. It was supposed to. By the time morning came again, the conditions would be right. He did not move. He watched the city below continue its damaged, resilient, entirely insufficient attempt to process what was happening to it. Then he settled in to wait. The second engagement between All Might and All for One began in the deep hours before dawn in a commercial district 3 kilometers north of the communications node. All for One had chosen the location with the same deliberation he brought to everything: wide streets, low residential density at this hour. Enough vertical clearance to operate without immediately collapsing occupied buildings. It was in its way a concession not to restraint, but to the recognition that dead civilians attracted response assets faster than contained combat. All Might had chosen to be there because there was nowhere else to be. They met in a cleared stretch of road that the evacuation order had emptied 40 minutes earlier. The hero units on the perimeter had the good discipline to hold their lines and the good sense to understand that moving closer would add casualties without adding capability. What was happening out there was not something a perimeter could affect. All for One opened at range. Air cannon, full compression, aimed at the center of mass, the kind of shot that had sent All Might through structures before and had opened more than one fight in AFO's long history of opening fights. All Might met it with a Detroit smash that intercepted the compressed airburst mid-travel and turned it into a pressure wave that blew outward in all directions, cracking every ground floor window in a 2-block radius and lifting 3 parked vehicles off the street simultaneously. The noise of it was geological. All for One moved using airwalk before the pressure wave finished expanding, taking an elevated angle off All Might's left shoulder and launching a rivet stab sequence, the black-red tendrils extending in a targeting pattern designed to constrain movement rather than destroy. All Might broke the first 2 with a Carolina smash, Bama Samash, that sent a shockwave through the site and stripped a meter of asphalt off the street surface. The third caught his right forearm and held for 1 second before he tore free. And in that second, All for One fired another air cannon burst that connected with full impact. All Might went back 40 meters. He came back in 4 seconds. This was the rhythm of the second encounter. AFO, keeping range layering, quirk combinations, probing for a structural weakness that decades of conflict had never fully revealed. All Might closing that range with overwhelming forward pressure, taking damage in exchange for proximity, trusting that his endurance would outlast AFO's toolkit. It was a rhythm both of them had run before. It would have resolved the same way given sufficient time. Neither of them was given sufficient time. The sound arrived first. Not the ordinary sonic boom of something large moving fast. Those had a recognizable shape, a compression and release that the ear could categorize. This was different. This was the sound of something moving at a velocity the air had no time to accommodate, a tearing quality that lasted less than a second and left behind a pressure change that people 3 kilometers away felt in their sinuses without understanding why. The object that produced it crossed the gap between the upper atmosphere and the street below, in a time that the perimeter unit's instruments logged as a rounding error. Nolan hit the open ground between All Might and All for One at a vector that was neither random nor compromising. The precise angle that maximized impact distribution across both of them simultaneously without requiring him to choose a primary target. The strike point was the air between them, The result was a shock wave that erased 50 meters of street surface in a radial pattern, shattered every window in a 4-block radius, and flipped a transit bus 3 blocks away onto its roof. All might was thrown westward. All for one was thrown north. Neither landed in the direction they had been facing. Nolan settled into the crater the impact had made and stood up. He took stock of where each of them had come down. Quiet, unhurried. Both were already moving. All for one recovered first because AFO's recovery was a function of calculation rather than physiology. He was back at elevation inside 4 seconds running. Searched to triangulate, already processing what had just happened with the cold attention he reserved for threats that did not fit his existing models. What had just happened did not fit his existing models. He had known Omni-Man was in the city. He had referenced it in the building deliberately. What he had not known, what no intelligence available to him had confirmed, was the true gap between Omni-Man's publicly demonstrated capabilities and his actual ceiling. The gap was larger than any model had suggested, significantly larger. All for one recalibrated in the time it took All Might to close to striking range with Nolan. All Might's opening was a Texas smash from the right flank, the kind of approach that worked against opponents who couldn't process lateral movement at that velocity. Nolan processed it. He stepped inside the arc, let the momentum pass his shoulder, by a margin that looked like a 1/4 inch from the perimeter cameras and was a 1/4 inch, and drove the strike's own energy into the ground between them. The impact excavated 3 meters of subsurface and sent a crack running 60 meters down the center of the street. All Might reset. Nolan held his ground, tracking All for one's bearing. "You came for both of us," All Might said. Not a question. "One at a time wouldn't hold," Nolan said. The first words he had spoken since arriving. Flat, even the tone of someone stating a logistical constraint. "One of you would disappear if the other fell first." All for one's air cannon came from the north elevation. At the same moment, a burst calibrated not to hit Nolan directly, but to occupy the space he would have to cross to pursue All Might. A hurting shot. AFO had read Nolan's tactical priority and was working to disrupt it. Nolan went through the burst. He caught the compressed air on his forearms, let the pressure spread across his body, and was through it before the compression had finished. He closed on All for one's elevation in a supersonic line that left a visible wake in the air, a vacuum trail that collapsed with a secondary crack. And All for one spent impact. Recoil to survive the first contact, the reflected energy sending Nolan back 30 meters, while AFO used the interval to shift along the roofline. 30 meters was 3/10 of a second. All Might use those 3/10. He came in from below with a raw, one-for-all application that was not one of his named strikes and did not need to be pressure delivered upward, less a punch than a geological event expressed through a human frame. It caught Nolan from the south as he was recovering from the north, and for 1 full second both impacts were on him simultaneously. He absorbed them. It cost him something. He had no intention of showing what. He came back down targeting not where All Might was standing, but where All Might would move in the next half-second, trusting that a man who had been fighting for a lifetime would instinctively step in the direction that opened his counter. All Might moved exactly as predicted. Nolan's strike caught him at the transition, the instant when momentum is committed and cannot be recalled, and drove All Might into the facade of the building behind him at a depth that took out the first 3 floors. The building held. Earthquake-rated construction. All Might came out of it. The 3 of them settled into something that was not a rhythm and not a stalemate, but a sustained mutual read conducted at extreme velocity, each processing the others and adjusting the sight and the blocks around it, accumulating a record of their movements, the way a drumhead records sand patterns under vibration. All for One understood within 90 seconds that direct engagement with Nolan was not viable. The gap was real, and no quirk combination would close it. What he was doing was deny clean angles. Air cannon bursts that forced micro-adjustments. Rivet stab tendrils that occupied the ground between Nolan and All Might when Nolan tried to isolate one of them. Warp insertions that shifted his bearing unpredictably and prevented Nolan from fixing either of them in place long enough to end it. All Might understood that he was the anchor. He was the reason. All for One's contribution still mattered because Nolan wanted both of them in the same window, and All Might refusing to break and run kept AFO tactically relevant. He held the line because holding the line was what he was for, and because somewhere on the perimeter there were units that had not evacuated fast enough, and somewhere beyond that there were civilians who had not left, and the further this stayed from them, the more of them would still be standing when it was over. He was running out of time. He could feel it not as pain exactly, but as the sensation of a resource being spent at a rate that could not be sustained. Each exchange with Nolan cost more than the last. Not because Nolan was increasing his effort, but because All Might's capacity to absorb and return was finite in a way that Nolan's apparently was not. He didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He spent what he had left the way you spend something you know you won't get back completely and without reservation. The Carolina Smash caught Nolan's left side during a grapple sequence and moved him 4 meters, the largest single displacement All Might had achieved all night. It was enough to tell him what he needed to know: the hits were landing. They were landing on something that could take them, but they were landing. He filed that away and kept moving. All for One's error was not tactical. He had been tactically sound throughout. His error was temporal. He had assumed the engagement could be maintained at its current pace, long enough for some variable to shift some opening. Some miscalculation by Nolan. Some combination of factors that would change the calculus enough to matter. Nolan didn't give him the time for a variable to emerge. He had been tracking All for One's movement intervals since the second minute. The roof line shifts. The elevation changes. The warp point patterns. All of it fed into a predictive model that required no conscious effort, just the long habit of a species that had been fighting wars for centuries. When All for One's next shift brought him to the northeast roof line at the interval, the pattern predicted Nolan was there before him, not waiting, moving to the same point on a faster line. The collision was not a strike in any conventional sense. It was a removal. Nolan took All for One out of his elevation and through the building behind it, and through the building behind that, 2 floors up the life support apparatus, taking structural damage that was not immediately critical, but was immediately significant. They came out the far side into an alley, and Nolan released him and stepped back. All for One hit the alley wall. He slid down it. He was breathing in a way that the mask had not been designed to manage under these conditions. He looked up at Nolan with the composed attention of someone who has lost and understands it. "What an interesting disaster you are," he said. "Unhurried even now. You break the world too quickly. That makes you wasteful." "You're still alive," Nolan said, "because I needed you in the same place as him." A beat. "Then you have what you needed," All for One said. The rivet stab came from his left hand, not at Nolan, but at the alley wall, using the impact rebound to push himself upright, buying a few seconds of standing and the bearing of a man who would not end this conversation on the ground. Nolan hit him once, precisely. In the location the life support structure was most vulnerable. All for One's breathing changed. The mask's systems tried to compensate. They were not sufficient. He went down without theater, without a final statement, without anything that would have satisfied an audience. Just a body reaching the end of what it could sustain, settling against the alley wall in the posture of something that had finally run out of continuations. All Might was still standing when Nolan came back to the site. Standing was perhaps imprecise. He was vertical. His weight was across both legs. He was not using the wall behind him, though the wall behind him had a shape in it that matched his silhouette. One for All was almost gone. He could feel the boundary, the thin edge of what remained with the clarity of a man who has spent his entire life learning exactly where the line is, so he can operate as close to it as possible. He looked at Nolan across 30 meters of ruined ground. "He's gone," he said. "Yes. Then it's just us." Nolan looked at All Might with a red he had been building all night, the same inventory. What he saw was a man who had spent everything available to him in service of something he believed was worth spending it on, and who was prepared to spend the remainder the same way. He recognized that, not with sympathy, with the accurate acknowledgement of what it was. "Your world was never safe because it had symbols," Nolan said. "It was safe because nothing had come for it yet. That changes tonight. People will still stand up," All Might said. "That never changes." "You're not the last obstacle," Nolan said. "You're the last symbol. When you're gone, what comes after me won't need to explain anything." Nolan crossed the ground between them. The United States of Smash, Iji met him at the midpoint. Everything left in the tank, every fraction of one for all that remained compressed into the final expression of a life spent holding a line. The collision was the loudest event of the night. The pressure wave it generated reached the perimeter units a full 2 seconds after it occurred, which meant it had traveled faster than sound, which meant it had been produced by something that exceeded what either of those terms was originally coined to describe. When the wave cleared, one figure was standing. All Might was in the ground, not in a crater in the ground. The surface closed around the impact point. The Earth having accepted the displacement of a body that had put everything it had into one final commitment and found it was not enough. He was breathing. That was what mattered. The rest was damage, and damage was recoverable. Nolan stood in the center of what the site had become, a geography of the night's events, a map drawn in asphalt and steel and broken infrastructure that would take months to fully document, and looked at the sky. He checked the time. Then from somewhere to the east, a sound arrived that was not a sonic boom, and not an explosion, and not any of the categories of sound the night had already produced. Rhythmic. Multiple sources, descending. The perimeter unit's instruments logged 14 separate contacts, dropping from high orbit on converging vectors. They matched nothing on record, no aircraft classification, no quirk manifestation, no designation of any kind, because there was nothing on record to match them to. 40 seconds from surface contact, the first unit commander keyed her comm and said very quietly, "Command, we have incoming. Multiple. Unknown origin. I need someone to tell me what I'm looking at." Command did not have an answer. The contacts continued their descent. Nolan didn't look up. He already knew what they were. He had been waiting for them since Georgia. The first wave touched down in the bay. Not a crash. A landing controlled measured the kind that produces a single large displacement rather than an explosion. The kind that told anyone watching that whatever was landing knew exactly how much force it was choosing to express. The swell reached the waterfront in under a minute and climbed the retaining walls and washed across the lower promenade, and then receded, carrying nothing with it, which was the only mercy in an otherwise merciless sequence of events. The second unit came down 3 kilometers inland in an industrial zone that the evacuation order from the previous night's combat had already cleared. The third landed in the same zone 40 meters from the second, then 2 more. then the rest arriving in a spacing pattern that suggested a formation rather than a scatter, that suggested orders, that suggested an organizations that had been doing this for a very long time on a very large number of worlds. 14 ships held orbit. What had landed were their advance units. The perimeter units that had survived the night did not advance. Their commanders, operating on the instinct that had kept them alive through decades of hero work, recognized that what they were looking at was not in any category they had been trained to address, and that the first and most important thing you do when you encounter something outside your training is stop doing the things your training tells you to do and start thinking. Most of them were doing a reasonable amount of thinking under the circumstances. In what remained of the commercial district, the hero units on evacuation detail were moving civilians north through a route they had mapped before the night began, and were grateful for now. The work was still and orderly in the manner that work becomes still and orderly when everyone involved knows the alternative is dying. No one was running. No one was shouting. The unit lead, a woman named Hayashi, who had been doing rescue operations for 11 years, kept her voice level and her pace steady and did not look back at the column of smoke and structural damage she was leading people away from. She had looked once. That was enough. 3 of her support units had calm silence, either in a zone where the network was down or not answering for a different reason. She filed that for later. The civilians in front of her needed to reach the designated shelter point first. After that, she would assess. After that, she would do whatever the next thing was. That was the job. You did the next thing. Her comm crackled with an update from the regional coordination hub. Something about the bay, something about incoming, something about hold position. She acknowledged it and kept walking. All might was pulled from the ground by 2 hero units who had found him by following the structural depression, rather than any signal because his comm had not survived the final exchange. He was conscious, which surprised both of them. He was aware of what had happened, which surprised them more. "The contacts," he said before either of them had finished confirming his vitals. "Sir, you need the contacts from orbit. How many?" One of them told him. He was silent for a beat, in the manner he had been silent in front of the commission liaison the previous morning. Not shock, not grief, but the recalibration of a mind that has been preparing for the worst and has just been handed something worse than its preparation. "Get me upright," he said. "Sir, your condition." "I know my condition." He looked at the unit who had spoken. "Get me upright." They got him upright. He stood on the broken street and looked north toward the bay, and the column of displaced water still visible in the pre-dawn dark. And he knew with the clarity that arrives when no remaining ambiguities are left to process exactly what the next several hours were going to ask of him. One for all was effectively gone. What remained was the body that had carried it for 30 years, and the will that had built the body, and the bone-deep recognition, older than the quirk itself, that the symbol of peace was not a power level. It was a choice repeated every day, regardless of what the power level was doing. He would make that choice again this morning, and the morning after, for as long as mornings remained available. "Where are the civilians?" he said. "Hayashi's team has the north corridor. The shelter points are..." "Take me to the nearest one." The Viltrumites did not immediately move from their landing zone. This was more unsettling than if they had. The hero units holding the perimeter watched the figures in the industrial zone through whatever optical equipment they had available and tried to extract tactical information from how they stood, how they looked at the city, how they appeared to be in no hurry at all. They were not in any hurry. One of the figures taller than the others, standing slightly ahead of the group, turned and looked toward the commercial district. Not at the perimeter, at the district, at what the night had done to it. A second figure moved to stand beside the first and said something. The first one answered briefly without looking away. An HPSC duty analyst watching the feed from a mobile relay unit wrote in his log in the pre-dawn hours, "They are assessing. They are not attacking. Unknown whether this is strategic patience or disinterest." He paused. Then he wrote, "Or both." That's it. Nolan was standing at the edge of the impact site when the first of them found him. He had been expecting it. The formation landing the spacing, the patient's standard Viltrum protocol for a secured target zone. Confirm the objective gauge, the condition of the asset, receive and transmit operational status. He had run this sequence on other worlds. He knew how it went. The one who found him was young by Viltrumite standards, which meant centuries rather than millennia. He had the build. They all had the same characteristic of taking up space, as if space was a resource that existed for their use. He looked at the district and then at Nolan with an expression that was not quite approval and not quite question. "You finished early," he said. "The conditions aligned." The second pillar. The younger Viltrumite glanced north toward where the bay disturbance was still visible. The report said 6 weeks minimum. The reports were based on public data. Nolan looked at the district. Neither of them was what the public data described. A pause. The younger one processed this the way Viltrumites process things that didn't match their models, briefly and without sentimentality. "The main fleet is holding orbit. Command wants a status report. Resistance is compromised. Primary threats are neutralized. Secondary hero infrastructure is functional, but overextended and psychologically degraded." Nolan's gaze moved north again. "They're still doing their jobs. That will matter less over time. Timeline for full approach? Tell them to hold." He turned to look at the younger Viltrumite directly. "The planet is not secure. It is accessible. Those are different conditions. Securing means breaking coordination and will not just removing capable bodies." The younger one held his gaze for a beat. A minor challenge by Viltrum standards, not aggressive, but present. "Command will want details. Command will get a full report when I finish the evaluation." Nolan's tone did not shift. It didn't need to. "Tell them to hold." Another beat. Then the younger Viltrumite nodded once and moved back toward the landing group. Nolan turned back to the city. The sun came up while the city was still processing the night. It rose without consultation, without regard for what had happened in the dark, without honoring any of the weight the night had accumulated. The light arrived the same way it always arrived, and nothing about it acknowledged that the world it was illuminating had changed. In the shelter point at the northern evacuation hub, 341 civilians were seated on benches and floors and sections of emergency bedding, and most of them were hushed in the manner people go hushed when the sound they would make doesn't match the scale of what they're feeling. A few of the children were asleep. One of the older women was talking low to a hero unit volunteer who had run out of official things to do and was doing the unofficial things instead. All Might walked in through the east entrance shortly after sunrise. He was not in good condition. Anyone who looked at him could see that. The suit was damaged in ways it was not supposed to be damageable. He was moving under his own power, but the character of the movement made clear this was a decision being enforced rather than a capacity being expressed. He stood at the entrance for a moment, and then he crossed to the center of the shelter. And he stood there where people could see him, and he looked at the room. The room looked back. He didn't say much. There was a child near the front, 7 or 8, sitting on a folded jacket watching him, with the focused attention children bring to things they are trying to decide whether to be frightened of. All Might crouched down to her level. He said something that wasn't audible from across the room. Whatever it was, she decided not to be frightened. That was enough. That was the whole thing. The adults in the room who had been maintaining the controlled stillness of people managing themselves were now maintaining something slightly different, not calm exactly, but the state of people who have been reminded that the structure they rely on has not fully collapsed, that there is still someone making the choice to stand between them and whatever is outside. It was a smaller promise than it had ever been. It was still a promise. 3 kilometers away, at the edge of the industrial zone, Nolan stood at the boundary between the landing site and the rest of the city and looked at the skyline, acquiring definition as the light increased. He had been on many worlds at the moment they grasped what was happening to them. Each had its own texture. Some fought at once, some froze, some kept doing the everyday things that everyday life requires, because everyday life is the only structure available. This one was keeping a shelter point running and moving civilians and doing the next thing. He noted that. It was tactically irrelevant, and he noted it anyway. The true things about a place, even when truth doesn't change the outcome. The city spread out in front of him, lit now, beginning the first movements of what would be a different kind of day than any it had previously experienced. In an hour, the news cycle would have the first images from the landing zone. In 2 hours, the HPSC would be an emergency session again this time, with parameters that made the previous session's concerns look like a baseline reading. By midday, the international response infrastructure would be trying to coordinate something that none of its frameworks had been designed to address. They would be insufficient. That was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. He turned from the skyline and walked back into the landing zone, and the Viltrumites there acknowledged him with the economy of soldiers who have learned that acknowledgement should cost nothing and waste nothing. Above them in orbit, 14 ships held their positions and waited. Below them, in a shelter point in the northern district, a child fell back asleep. The sun continued to rise. By the time the city's first light arrived, the silhouettes were visible from the ground without optical equipment. Not all 14. The main fleet had shifted from high orbit to low above the atmosphere, technically beyond the reach of anything currently deployed against them, but low enough that on a clear morning you could step outside and look up and see the shapes against the pale sky, 9 distinct shadows moving in formation, slow enough to track with the naked eye. The other 5 were already inside the atmosphere. The HPSC emergency broadcast system activated in the early morning. It told people to stay indoors. It told them to move to designated shelter points if they had not already done so. It told them the situation was being monitored and that further guidance would follow. It did not tell them that the regional coordination network had lost contact with 3 of its central relay nodes in the previous 40 minutes, or that 2 military installations had stopped responding, or that a hero agency in Sapporo had reported a Viltrumite presence and then gone silent mid-transmission. The broadcast repeated on a 90-second loop. In Osaka, in Fukuoka, in Sendai, people heard the broadcast and looked out their windows and saw the same shapes in the sky that people in Tokyo were seeing. And the instruction to stay indoors began to feel less like safety guidance and more like acknowledgement that there was nowhere else to recommend. The demonstration happened within the first hour of morning in the airspace above the government district. A nationally ranked Hero 11th, with a long-range quirk rated in the top tier of combat-effective applications, responded to the incursion with the speed and discipline her ranking indicated. She was in the air inside 90 seconds of the nearest contact, entering her jurisdiction. She made the intercept at 400 meters altitude and led with her most effective output a sustained thermal current that could strip the exterior off a reinforced vehicle at this range. The Viltrumite it hit adjusted his flight path by 2 degrees to account for the heat differential and hit her with an open-hand strike that was not designed to be lethal and was not lethal, and put her through a government building's top 3 floors and left her in the rubble breathing broken and removed from the engagement. The whole sequence took 11 seconds. The perimeter units below had their optical equipment on her when it happened. So did 3 news relays that had not yet been directed to shut down their feeds. By mid-morning, the footage had reached every major network still transmitting. The message it sent needed no interpretation. It required only the basic arithmetic of comparing her capabilities, documented, publicly rated, understood to represent the high end of what hero response infrastructure could field against 11 seconds and an open hand. Response agencies nationwide began receiving calls within minutes. Not for help, to ask whether anyone should go outside at all. And Nolan came down from altitude later that morning and landed in the open plaza in front of the HPSC's regional headquarters. No announcement, no approach, none of the theater a public address would normally involve. He stood in the plaza and waited. The building's outer security responded. 2 heroes on perimeter duty took positions flanking the entrance. He looked at them with the patient attention of someone waiting for a door to open. "Tell whoever is in charge that the terms are simple," he said. Conversational volume. It carried without effort. No organized resistance. Civilian infrastructure operates under Viltrumite oversight. Anyone who does their job continues doing their job. Anyone who doesn't. He paused, not from uncertainty, but from the economy of a man who has delivered this address before and knows exactly where to let silence work. The demonstration this morning was the minimum. We have no need to exceed the minimum. Neither of the perimeter heroes spoke. "I'm not here to negotiate," Nolan said. "I'm here to tell you what has already been decided. Tell whoever needs to know." He stepped back from the entrance, looked up at the shapes in the sky, and rose. In the northern shelter point, All Might heard the broadcast repeat for the 4th time and grasped what the 90-second loop meant. Whoever was running the system was running it on automatic because the people who had been running it manually were no longer in a position to update the message. He stood up from the bench where a commission aide had been arguing with him about his medical condition for the previous 20 minutes and walked to the shelter's main entrance. "You can't go out there," the aide said. "I know." He looked at the street. The morning was clear. He could see 2 of the orbital shapes from where he stood defined against the blue, like marks on a map that hadn't existed yesterday. "I'm not going to fight. There's nothing left to fight with." He said it without self-pity as a logistical fact. But there are people moving through the northern corridor who are going to panic when they see what's in the sky. And if they panic on an evacuation route, people get hurt in ways that have nothing to do with any of this. He looked back at the aide. "That I can still prevent." He went out. The street was not empty. It was never entirely empty. Even now, people moving heads down in the configuration of people who have decided that forward motion is the one response available to them. A few looked up when they saw him. He looked back. He didn't smile. That expression had always come from a specific energy, and the energy was spent. But standing there upright, visible, present on the same street they were present on, communicated something that didn't require the smile. He started walking the corridor. He kept pace with the evacuation flow. He said when he needed to say it, "Keep moving. The shelter point is 2 blocks north. You're doing fine." Small words, true words, the only kind left. As the morning progressed, the global air traffic network registered simultaneous anomalies across 4 continents. Not new fleets, patrol units, and drop corridors, the same signatures repeating in different skies. The reports used different language, unexpected atmospheric contacts, unregistered aerial signatures, deviations from standard flight patterns, but they were describing the same thing, in the way that witnesses to the same event used different words to mean identical facts. The shapes above Tokyo had counterparts. Not just here. In a basement situation room in Brussels, a duty officer pulled up the aggregated report and looked at it for a long time. then pulled up a second screen showing the Tokyo demonstration footage and looked at that for a long time. And then she did the only thing the situation called for. Send the report up the chain and wait and consider whether anything in any structure she had been given was adequate for what the report described. There wasn't. The chain would reach the same conclusion within the hour. Every chain would. By late morning, the story had shifted. It stopped being Omni Man killed America's #1 and became something with a different gravity. Omni Man is in Japan. The first confirmation did not come from Tokyo's public channels. It came from overlapping sources. Civilian footage of a crater that matched the scale of Georgia's scattered police band transcripts mentioning an unidentified aerial combatant, and a short message from an HPSC liaison to allied agencies that contained 3 words, "All might is down." Within an hour, the name Omni-Man was no longer attached to a man. It was attached to a location on a map, and the location was moving. Governments ran the same question through different languages and reached the same answer. This was not a domestic incident, and it had never been. Airspace restrictions expanded in rings from Tokyo outward. Satellite tasking shifted from weather and fires to tracking a point that kept vanishing into atmospheric noise. In cities that had never seen organized villain activity, spike emergency lines filled anyway. Not with reports, but with questions. Criminal networks read the same headlines and started repositioning. Hero agencies read them and started losing personnel to exhaustion and fear. The system did not collapse everywhere at once. It just stopped feeling certain. By midday, Hayashi's evacuation team had moved 317 people to shelter points and was starting on a 4th circuit of the northern corridor. 3 of her support units were still calm silent. She had stopped noting that for later and started treating it as a fixed condition. You work with what you have. The corridor was getting harder to move through, not because of the people who were disciplined in the manner people become disciplined under extended stress, but because of the infrastructure. 2 blocks south of the 3rd shelter point, a section of overhead rail had come down at an angle that narrowed the usable path to approximately 2 meters wide. It had fallen during the night during the combat, and nobody had cleared it because nobody had been available, and the evacuation priority had kept everything else subordinate. She and 2 of her team moved the debris by hand. It took 11 minutes. They moved on. By early afternoon, the 5th orbital shape had entered the atmosphere and descended to low altitude over the central district, joining the 4 that had been holding station since morning. At this altitude, the formations were audible, not loudly, but with the persistent low-frequency presence of very large objects moving through air in a way that air was not built to accommodate. The sound carried for kilometers. It was not threatening. It was there the way mountains are there. Nolan watched the approach from the roof of a building in the central district and checked the reports coming in from the landing units. Infrastructure secured. Communication nodes degraded. The coordinated hero response network was fractured into local units operating without central direction, responsive to immediate conditions, useless at anything requiring scale or planning. The evaluation Viltrum command required was close to complete. One variable remained: psychological cohesion. Social systems did not collapse at the moment their infrastructure was degraded. They collapsed when enough members stopped not believing the structure was worth maintaining. That process took longer. It was less predictable. It was the variable that centuries of conquest had taught them to respect. This world's cohesion was lower than it had been 48 hours ago. It was not 0. He looked down at the street. He, a hero in a yellow support costume, not a combat specialist, some kind of rescue worker, was directing a group of civilians around a debris field with the calm efficiency of someone who has been doing exactly this for years and intends to keep doing it. He watched for a moment. Then he turned away and continued the evaluation. That afternoon, All Might was standing at the northern end of the evacuation corridor when a Viltrumite came down from low altitude and landed 20 meters in front of him. Not Nolan. Younger. The same build, the same bearing the character of attention that develops over centuries of not needing to be cautious. The Viltrumite regarded him with mild interest. As you regard something you have been briefed on and are now seeing in person for the first time, you're the one they built the system around, he said. All Might looked back. He was aware of what he looked like, the damaged suit, the posture holding itself upright through will rather than capacity, the absence of the energy, the symbol of peace had always carried. He was aware this was visible. I'm the one who's still here, he said. The Viltrumite looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at the civilians moving through the corridor behind. All Might, the stream of people heads down, moving toward shelter. You're slowing them down, the Viltrumite said. Not a threat, an observation. They're frightened of the confrontation. If you step aside, they move faster. All Might considered this. They're moving, he said. That's what matters. The Viltrumite held his gaze for a beat. Then he rose unhurried and rejoined the patrol. All Might watched him go. Then he turned back to the corridor. Keep moving, he said. 2 blocks north. You're doing fine. Late in the afternoon, the HPSC broadcast updated for the first time in hours. The new message was shorter. Shelter points remain open. Medical support is available. Maintain current positions. Nothing about the situation resolving. Nothing about response operations. It was the message of a system that had moved from managing an emergency to managing a condition, one that was not temporary, not escalating, simply present and requiring continued attention. Outside, the shapes in the sky had not moved. They did not need to. They were doing their work by existing. The call was not public. It was not ceremonial. It was a line of exhausted faces in bad lighting, stitched together by encrypted uplink in the hours between afternoon and evening across 5 time zones. The top-ranked heroes still operational had one shared problem. The frameworks they had trained inside did not contain a category for what had happened in Georgia and what was happening now in Tokyo. Someone said what everyone had been circling. He doesn't belong to any villain classification we have. Another voice answered flat with fatigue. Then we stopped treating him like one. The plan was lean because anything elaborate would fail before it could be deployed. Consolidate what remained select terrain away from population centers, force Omni-Man into a sustained engagement long enough to identify his limits if limits existed. It was not confidence. It was not victory. It was the closest thing to a decision the world had been able to produce since Georgia. And for approximately 40 minutes, it functioned as something resembling hope. Then the call dropped. Not a technical failure. The uplink went down because the satellite node routing it had been deprioritized by something that had taken over the frequency band, something large, multiple sources arriving from directions that did not correspond to any known orbital traffic. By the time anyone on the call re-established contact, the question on the table had changed. The sun set. As it went down, the orbital shapes became harder to see against the darkening sky. And then the lights on their undersides became visible, steady white, not intended as display but present anyway. The way the infrastructure of any large occupied system becomes visible after dark. Below them, the shelter points were running. The evacuation corridors were hushed but not empty. In 11 countries on 4 continents, Organizations that had no prepared structure for the situation were building improvised ones because that is what organizations do when their structures fail. They build new ones, inadequate and immediate, because the work still needs doing. Nolan stood at the edge of the industrial zone as the last daylight faded and looked at the city below and considered the report he would send upward when the evaluation was complete. The infrastructure phase was done, the demonstration phase was done. What remained was the long, slow, technically difficult process of transitioning a populated planet from self-governance to administered dependency. A process that Viltrum had run enough times to have protocols for, but that was never fast and never clean, because it required not just the absence of resistance, but the presence of something else. The gradual, irreversible recognition in enough people that the order they had lived inside was no longer the order that governed their lives. That took time. This world would take more time than most. He had noted that. It was in the report. He looked at the city. The shelter points lit the evacuation routes, moving the broadcast, transmitting its short, careful message, and held it in the same register as everything else true about this place that did not change the outcome. Then the orbital tracking networks that were still running registered a new pattern, not the 14 ships already logged. Something behind them, a second layer holding at higher altitude, visible only now that the first wave had descended far enough to open the angle. The instruments logged the contacts one by one, and then in groups, and then stopped logging individually because the count had passed the threshold where individual tracking was meaningful. Somewhere on the interrupted hero call, a technician who had managed to re-establish a partial uplink looked at the readout on her screen and understood what the shift in the plan meant. The question was no longer how to stop Omni-Man. It had never been about Omni-Man. He had been the schedule. The army was the army. Above him, more ships entered low orbit. Below him, the world continued doing what it knew how to do. Somewhere in the northern district, the lights in the shelter points stayed on. The night settled over the city, and the city endured it, and the shapes in the sky did not leave.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.